British Indian Empire. Starting with the East India Company, the British had already emerged as the dominant force in South Asia. Their rise to power was gradual, extending over a period of nearly 100 years. By 1845, the British Empire had expanded from Bengal to Sindh, and all that remained free was Punjab, which had traditionally been a different ball game altogether. It had been ruled by successive conquerors marching into India through the Khyber Pass, forming the western flank of the subcontinent. Punjab remained an area of great strategic importance to all rulers of India. It was a very large administrative division centered on Lahore and included not only the present-day Indian and Pakistani Punjab regions but also the northwest frontier districts bordering Afghanistan. Much of the region had been the Sikh Empire, ruled by Ranjit Singh since 1799 until his death in 1839. The kingdom had then fallen into disorder, with the court factions and the Khalsa contending for power at Lahore Darbar. After two Anglo-Sikh wars, the entire region was annexed by the East India Company in 1849. The Kohinoor diamond that Ranjit Singh had worn in his headdress now became a part of the crown jewels at Westminster. Subsequently, the East India Company effected far-reaching changes in the area. One of these was the change in the court language. Even during the Sikh rule, the court language had remained Persian, but under British rule it was changed, first to Urdu and then to English. The Western education system was introduced and knowledge of English made compulsory. These changes adversely affected the Muslims who, being in a shock of having lost out to the British, were not ready yet to grasp the new configuration of forces. When the British first appeared on the scene, they saw that it would be to their advantage to heighten these Hindu-Muslim contrasts. There was even an attempt to rewrite Indian history so as to show Muslims as oppressors and persecutors in order that the Hindus, who form the bulk of India's population, should have a more lively appreciation of the blessings of British rule. For a century and a half, the English had been humble petitioners to the Mughal emperors and their viceroys. But as the Mughal Empire started declining, the British took no time in changing their role. Events turned in their favor about the middle of the 18th century, and for the next 100 years they were engaged in exploiting and undermining the empire of their erstwhile patrons. In this undertaking they employed all the weapons of diplomacy, force, and bluff which they had used with equal advantage in their trade with India. The Hindus with whom they had long been connected through trade were their natural allies in this struggle against the Muslims. And when they finally won in 1857, the English used their power to crush the Muslims still further. The struggle for freedom which led to the uprising of 1857 ended in disaster for Muslims. The Mughal Empire was extinguished and the British government assumed sovereignty over the lands of the British East India Company. In November 1858, the company was abolished and the British government took direct control of India. The British control over the subcontinent grew in the next 50 years and culminated in the British Raj. The Governor-General of India gained a new title, Viceroy of India. In 1877, Queen Victoria took the title of Empress of India. On the advice of Prime Minister Benjamin, her Indian empire's realm continued to expand until Hunza, the remote kingdom bordering China, fell into British hands in 1891. Bringing the expansion to its zenith, the British delineated the frontier separating British India from Afghanistan in 1893. The resulting Durand Line cut straight through the tribal area of the Pathans. The British left the tribal areas to govern themselves under the supervision of British political agents. The British thus became masters of India, where for nearly a millennium Muslims had ruled. The colonial administration embarked on a program of reform trying to integrate Indian higher caste and rulers into the government and abolishing attempts at westernization. The viceroy stopped land grabs, decreed religious tolerance, and admitted Indians into civil service, albeit mainly as subordinates. In looking for the causes of the mutiny, the authorities alighted on two things: religion and the economy. On religion, it was felt that there had been too much interference with the indigenous traditions, both Hindu and Muslim. On the economy, it was now believed that the previous attempts by the company to introduce free market competition had undermined traditional power structures and bonds of loyalty, placing the peasantry at the mercy of merchants and moneylenders. In consequence, though theoretically the new British Raj was constructed in part around a conservative agenda, based on preservation of tradition and hierarchy, but in actual effect, the British rulers characterized the outbreak as an act of treachery against themselves and called it the mutiny. It continued to be so described throughout the British Raj. The Victorian model of administration in British India became the standard reference point for law, order, and probity in areas that are now contemporary Pakistan. At the apex of the administration stood the Governor-General, almost always a British peer. The Governor-General held supreme legislative and executive powers and was responsible directly to the Secretary of State for India, a member of the British Cabinet. British India was divided into provinces for administrative purposes, each headed, depending on size and importance, by a governor or lieutenant governor. Provinces were divided into divisions, and these in turn were divided into districts. The basic administrative units encompasses substantial territory and population. In many cases, the provinces and districts followed the lines of those created by the Mughals. The district officer was the linchpin of the system. The officer was revenue collector as well as dispenser of justice and was called district collector, district magistrate, and in some areas deputy commissioner. With equal validity, district officers were usually drawn from the prestigious meritocracy, the Indian Civil Service. Recruitment to the Indian Civil Service was competitive, based on examination of young men with a British classical education. Exclusively British at its beginning, the Indian Civil Service was forced to open its doors to a limited number of successful Indian candidates. After 1871, district boards and municipal committees were established to assist the district officers in their administrative functions. Thus elective politics in however limited a form were introduced to the subcontinent. The Governor-General was also known as the Viceroy and Crown representative when dealing with Indian princes. Relations between British Crown and Indian princes were set out in an elusive doctrine of paramountcy. The princes promised loyalty and surrendered are rights to conduct foreign or defense policy. The Crown promised non-interference in internal affairs except in cases of gross maladministration or injustice, and protection from external enemies. The British Raj was socially and politically conservative, but it brought profound economic change to the subcontinent. For strategic, administrative, and commercial reasons, the British developed transportation and communications, including a vast road and railway system, and kept them in good repair. Coal mines were opened in Bihar and Bengal, and irrigation canals were laid out in Yamuna, also seen as Jammu, Ganges, and India's Valley, which was to become the largest irrigated area in the world. The developmental changes brought about by the British were the best thing they did for the people of the subcontinent. The expansion of a vast irrigation network in Punjab led to the development of canal colonies settled mainly by Sikh and Muslims, and the designation of Punjab as the granary of India. Law and order guaranteed a high rate of return on British and later Indian investment in these enterprises. Unfortunately, the native successors after the independence, at least in Pakistan, have failed to preserve and maintain the infrastructures left behind by the British. The roads, railways system, bridges, and canals have all been suffering worst neglect. On a political level, it was also felt that the previous lack of consultation between rulers and ruled had been yet another significant factor in contributed to the uprising. In consequence, Indians were drawn into government at a local level, but this policy turned out to be blatantly discriminatory in favor of Hindus. As was manifest in the sport, the British gave them in their political awakening and mobilization in the late 1880s and beyond. Heyday of the Empire of British. In the second half of the 19th century, both the direct administration of India by the British Crown and the technological change ushered in by the Industrial Revolution had the effect of closely intervening the economies of India and Great Britain. In fact, many of the major changes in transport and communications that are typically associated with Crown rule of India had already begun before mutiny. Since Dalhousie had embraced the technological change then rampant in Great Britain, India too saw rapid development of all those technologies. Railways, roads, canals and bridges were rapidly built in India, and telegraph links equally rapidly established in order that raw materials such as cotton from India's hinterland could be transported more efficiently to ports, such as Bombay for subsequent export to England. Likewise, finished goods from England were transported back just as efficiently for sale in the burgeoning Indian markets. However, unlike Britain itself, where the market risks for the infrastructure development were borne by the private investors in India, it was the taxpayers, primarily farmers and farm laborers, who endured the risk, which in the end amounted to €50 million. In spite of this course, very little skilled employment was created for Indians. By 1920, with the fourth largest railway network in the world and a history of 60 years of its construction, only 10% of the superior posts in the Indian Railways were held by Indians. The rush of technology was also changing the agricultural economy in India. By the last decade of the 19th century, a large fraction of some raw materials, not only cotton but also some food grains, were being exported to faraway markets. Consequently, many small farmers depended on the whims of those markets, lost land, animals, and equipment to moneylenders. More tellingly, the latter half of the 19th century also saw an increase in the number of large-scale famines in India. Although famines were not new to the subcontinent, these were particularly severe, with tens of millions dying and with many critics, both British and Indian, laying the blame at the doorsteps of the lumbering colonial administrations. Although the Great Uprising of 1857 had shaken the British enterprise in India, it had not derailed it until 1857. The British, especially under Lord Dalhousie, had been hurriedly building an India which they envisaged to be on par with Britain itself in the quality and strength of its economy and social institutions. After the rebellion, the British became more circumspect. Much thought was devoted to the causes of the rebellion, and from it three main lessons were drawn. At a more practical level, it was felt that after the rebellion of 1857, the Indian Army was completely reorganized units composed of the Muslims and Brahmins of the United Provinces of Agra and Oudh, who had formed the cover of the rebellion, were disbanded. New regiments like the Sikhs and Balochis, composed of Indians who in the British estimation had demonstrated steadfastness, were formed. From then on, the Indian Army was to remain unchanged in its organization until 1947. It was also felt that both the princes and the large landholders, by not joining the rebellion, had proved to be, in Lord Canning's words, breakwaters in a storm. They too were rewarded in the new British Raj by being officially recognized in the treaties each state now signed with the Crown. At the same time, it was felt that the visions for whose benefit the large land reforms of the United Provinces had been undertaken had shown disloyalty, by in many cases fighting for their former landlords against the British. Consequently, no more land reforms were implemented for the next 90 years. Bengal and Bihar were to remain the realms of large land holdings, unlike the Punjab and UP. Lastly, the British felt disenchanted with Indian reaction to social change. Until the rebellion, they had enthusiastically pushed through social reform, like the ban on sati by Lord William Bentinck. It was now felt that traditions and customs in India were too strong and too rigid to be changed easily. Consequently, no more British social interventions were made, especially in matters dealing with religion, even when the British felt very strongly about the issue, as the instance of the remarriage of Hindu child widows. The Britishers did not touch the Muslims and Hindus to change their religion, customs, beliefs, and many other things. They introduced Legislative Council Acts of 1861, in which they give to representation of Indian in civil services and more little positional post. In the Legislative Council Act 1861, they introduce clearly the difference and features of the position of Governor-General, and they introduce which kind of policies would we pursue to maintain the law and order in the subcontinent. After it, the Britishers introduced the Indian Council Act of 1892. In this act, the number of the non-official members in the central and provincial legislative councils were increased. However, the official members were still in majority. The members of the legislative council were given the right to put questions. They were also authorized to discuss the annual budget. The local bodies were given right to send their elected members to the legislative councils.